Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you. This is KRWG, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Thanks for joining us on this special edition of Newsmakers. I'm Fred Martino. Special doesn't actually describe the life of my guest today. Extraordinary is a better fit. Delano Lewis served as the U.S. Ambassador to South Africa in the Clinton administration, and that came after an amazing career that included work in the Justice Department, the Peace Corps, service as a corporate executive, and as the president of NPR. Delano Lewis writes about all of it in his book, It All Begins with Self: How to Discover Your Passion, Connect with People, and Succeed in Life. It's an honor to welcome my friend and an advisor to KRWG, Delano Lewis. Delano, thanks for being here today.
Thank you, Fred. It's great to be here.
It's good to have you here. I want to start with your decision to write this book.
Well, the decision came with the family. It was my wife, Gail, and my sons. We have 4 sons and blessed with 11 grandchildren. It was one of my sons, Brian Lewis, who's written a book, and Gail has written 2 books. They said, you really need to put these experiences down so that the kids will know and the grandchildren will know your life experiences. And so that was sort of the motivation. And then Brian talked to me about it personally and said, Dad, I would love for you to do this because I know that you've been a teacher, and if you put this down, there'll be some teaching lessons for not only for us, but for a lot of others. So that's how it started.
I want to start in the beginning, as you do in the book, growing up in Kansas City, Kansas, in a segregated community.
Yes, Kansas City, Kansas. Most people don't really know about Kansas City, Kansas. They know about Kansas City, and it's very interesting. There's a Kansas City, Missouri, and there's a Kansas City, Kansas. Missouri came in as a slave state. Kansas came in as a free state. Most activities went across the river in Kansas City, Missouri. But I grew up in Kansas City, Kansas, and it was segregated on both sides of the river. So I went to all black schools from elementary to high school. I graduated in 1956, and we know the Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision in '54, which desegregated schools. That involved the elementary schools in Kansas. The secondary schools across the state were integrated, except my school. It was still segregated from elementary through high school. Linda Brown was trying to get into an elementary school and brought one of those 5 cases before the Supreme Court. So I went in a segregated school all of my life. We had 1 white student graduate with us in 1956. I was in an all-black neighborhood. I remember the lunch counters being segregated on Minnesota Avenue, just a few blocks from where I lived. But my high school was only a couple of blocks from my house, and it was a fantastic high school. And I talk about it in the book because those teachers cared about us. They gave us great attention. They were very well qualified because many of them couldn't find jobs because of discrimination in other places. So they were at our school, Sumner High School. So that was my background, and it laid the foundation for many things that I talk about in the book.
And you talk about a lot of turning points in the book. One, at a young age, while still in school, was a program called Boys State, which you said had a profound effect. For folks who are not familiar with that program, tell us about the program and what it meant to you.
I certainly will. It's still in existence today. It's an American Legion program of government in action. There is a girl state as well, but they are separate. And they teach young people. They're usually between your junior year in high school and your senior year in high school, where you're selected by your high school or your community group to represent your state. And in Kansas, it's about 500 boys who are selected. So my principal, Mr. Thompson, selected me along with my good buddy, Dan Matthews. We were very close friends. And we were delegates to the Boys State in 1955. And this is the first time that I had interacted with people of other races and other parts of Kansas. And so I was a little bit fearful about being in this environment, but I must tell you that I flourished. It was an exciting time for me. I gained my footing, I gained confidence. I ran for mayor of the city and was elected. I ran for a Supreme Court justice position and I was elected, 7 members of the Kansas Supreme Court, and I was drum major of the Boys State Band. So I had a great experience at Boys State, and it gave me that confidence very early on that even coming from a segregated background, I too could succeed, I too could compete. So it was a very, very meaningful experience.
So I guess with that in mind, I mean, you consider this incredibly important for young people, that while they're still in middle school, in high school, that they have opportunities to gain leadership skills, and not just in the classroom, but outside in the real world, so to
That's
speak.
absolutely right. In the first part of the book, I talk about my background, but I also talk about how to go about doing this. And I talk about a self-assessment, getting a sense of who you are. What are your strengths? What are the things that you're good at? What are the things you're not so good at? What are the things you like to do? And hopefully your strengths really correspond and match those things you like to do. That's the best of all worlds. And then you gain some confidence in yourself and begin to explore. But you need to start with a self-assessment, a sense of you. And that's why I talk about it all begins with self. Yes, you're going to have obstacles in your way. Yes, there could be discrimination. There could be people who don't like you. But if you have a sense of purpose, a sense of focus of who you are, and a determination, you too can make it happen.
After pursuing your undergraduate education in Kansas, you decided to go to law school. Tell me about that decision.
Well, I did my self-assessment quite early in life, and some people may do it along the way. But I did it when I was in high school mainly, and I got the sense of what is it that I'm very good at. And I had some leadership qualities, I had some speaking abilities, I could communicate with people. And so I thought about, in this segregated environment I'm living in, I thought about maybe law might be the way to go, because I really felt the rule of law would maybe change some of the things in our society. And as we look back 50 years back and now forward, yes, law is a very, very important tool in changing things. So when I graduated from high school, it had a list of my activities: National Honor Society, drum major in the band, International Club, but it had ambition, lawyer. So in 1956, I said I wanted to be a lawyer. So I graduated at age 17, and 7 years later, with that determination I talked about, I went on to Washburn School of Law and became a lawyer at age 24. But I had a sense of where I wanted to go.
And talking about the law having that opportunity to make a difference, that's really how your career started. After graduating from law school, you worked for the Department of Justice. Tell me about that experience at such a pivotal time.
Yes, I talk a lot about relationships and people that you know. It was my next door neighbor at law school who worked for the United States Attorney for the state of Kansas. And she was the one who recommended to Mr. George that I should be considered for a position with the honors program of the Department of Justice. And he was a strong Kennedy friend and a very good friend of Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General. And he sent a note to his good friend Bobby Kennedy and said, "Dear Bobby, I'd like for you to meet this young man. He's in law school, supporting his family. I was married at that time with one child. And he's working 40 hours a week. I worked as a child care worker at the Miniger Clinic with disturbed boys. So I worked full-time and went to law school full-time. So he said to Bobby Kennedy, you need to meet this young man. I think he would be an honor student if he hadn't had to do all those things in supporting his family and going to school." So Robert Kennedy accepted that, believed that, and I was appointed as an attorney with the Department of Justice. That was my first job out of law school. So the relationship with my next door neighbor, being qualified when the door opened, I had the necessary skills after the interview and after law school to assume this position. So I talk about that in the book, about how you too can do that if you have that sense of confidence and focus.
I know you also talk about in the book working for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Tell me about that experience and the importance of that agency at that time and then today.
Yes, I had always wanted to be in civil rights. As I said, I thought about going into law so that I could be involved in the civil rights movement as a lawyer. But married and with a child and thinking about having to provide and be responsible for my family, I was very excited to have this position with the Justice Department. But I was in the Internal Security Division of Justice. I wasn't in the Civil Rights Division. But yet I was learning how to be a lawyer in the federal government. But when the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission was established, it was a part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It's Title VII of 1964, dealing with employment discrimination. But one of the things in the debate on that bill, and I had a chance to go to Capitol Hill and listen to some of the debate in those years, there was a Dirksen amendment from Senator Everett Dirksen of Illinois. And he said business needs a year to get ready for equal employment. Now, as a civil rights person, we've been dealing with this issue of discrimination for over 200 years. Now we're going to give business another year to get ready, and that's exactly what passed. That amendment passed. So Title VII didn't go into existence until 1965. So the doors opened for Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. There was a good friend of mine, again relationships, Samuel C. Jackson, who was a lawyer from Topeka, African American, Republican, and he had gone to Washburn Law School. So he was a very young lawyer, active in the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and he was one of the two Republican commissioners on the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. So immediately I called Sam and said, you know, Sam, I'm finished law school, I'm working at Justice Department, and I've always been interested in civil rights and those issues. I know you're a commissioner. And he said, yes, you've heard about my appointment, and you've been in Washington a couple of years, you want to know what I can do for you? I said, that's exactly right. And so Sam understood it, and he said, well, what I'm going to do is to work through a task force from Justice. And I'll hopefully I'll see that you can get on that task force. So I was one of 3 lawyers on the task force that helped to set up the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Now you talk about its importance. We have a number of people who've gone through the EEOC as chairpersons. The first chairman, most people don't know, was Franklin Delano Roosevelt Jr. He was the first chairman of EEOC. Clarence Thomas was also chairman of the EEOC. We've had Eleanor Holmes Norton. She is the non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives from the District of Columbia. She was one of the very late, more recent chairs of the EEOC.
So you must be very proud that you were there at the beginning.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
And I was not in the General Counsel's office, I was in the Office of Compliance. And we were looking at the complaints as they came in the door to see if they met the criteria to be considered as a complaint to be investigated and to move forward. And I remember those letters that came through. People thought we'd get 100 complaints in a year. We got over 1,000 complaints when we opened up our doors.
Wow.
So EEOC was behind once those doors opened. And I remember looking at those letters, and it would say, "Dear Mr. Roosevelt, if you're anything like your father, you'll listen to my complaint." And so people really believed that maybe this was a place that they could go to because the Roosevelt, and there was a Roosevelt as the chair, they would get listened to because there was employment discrimination that was going on throughout our country.
Must have been, in terms of the staff working on that, a sense of enormous responsibility.
Absolutely
reading
was.
personal stories.
Absolutely was.
After this, you make an enormous switch going into the Peace Corps, to work for the Peace Corps. Tell me about that decision and such an amazing difference in your career.
I talk about that in the book, in the chapter about moving outside your comfort zone. Getting a sense of yourself, getting understanding of yourself, self-confidence, getting a strong educational background, the skills necessary to succeed. And then I talk about, as you look at your career, you may feel you might be in a rut, or you may want to shift or think about it. And I talk about maybe think of things outside your comfort zone. So I was at a dinner party with a Justice Department colleague and his wife in Washington. And a woman leaned across the table and said, "How would you like to go to Africa?" And I looked at her and I said, "Africa? I'm just out of Kansas." And that's exactly what I said. After a wonderful dinner and several glasses of wine, I said, "How can I do that?" She said, "You can go as United States Peace Corps." I said, "Peace Corps?" This was in 1965. I said, "I thought that was for younger people, not married. I'm married, I have 3 children now." She said, "You can go as Peace Corps staff. Here's my card." It said, "Cynthia Courtney, Desk Officer, West Africa, Peace Corps." So I interviewed with her, and 6 months later, Gail and my 3 sons, Dell was 5, Jeff was 3, Brian was 2. We were on a plane destined for Nigeria.
So tell me the impact that you think that decision had on not only your career, moving out of your comfort zone, as you said, but on your life.
It was a tremendous impact. Number one, moving outside the comfort zone, shifting from my career dealing with the law in the federal government, justice and EEOC, moving into a more administrative work as a staff person. I was an associate director of the Peace Corps in Benin City, Nigeria. knowing then I'm going to be an administrator. But what it did was opened up a whole new horizon for me and for my family. We were living in Benin City, Nigeria. We were living in a whole new culture. We were understanding and relating to people that of another culture, learning and listening to different languages, getting a sense of yourself and working in a different place. And so it was a tremendous impact. And then after we had to leave because of the Civil War, we evacuated Peace Corps. I came back to Washington and I was promoted. And I was 28 years old, and I was promoted to be the country director of the Peace Corps in Uganda. So I had a chance to see West Africa for over a year. Now I'm going to East Africa, and now I'm in charge of 160 volunteers. So I became chief of an organization at age 28. Now I'm really dealing with administration and learning a lot every day and living and working in a beautiful country and with very, very exciting, beautiful people. So it had a tremendous impact. And then several years later, after other jobs and position, becoming an ambassador, I remembered those days in the Peace Corps. And they gave me a great deal of help and advice and understanding as I became an ambassador.
I imagine so. So coming back from the Peace Corps, you move into another field. You've had so many different careers, in a sense, really, within your life. You worked for Senator Edward Brooke of Massachusetts, and you talk about this in the book. You note that he was the first African American elected to the Senate since Reconstruction. So tell me about this decision to get into the political world.
Well, it's interesting, and living in Washington is really sort of the key. It's a lawyer's town. People live in Washington and work in Washington. Most of them are lawyers. They work inside the government. They work outside the government. So when you say different careers, think about it as a federal career. And then it begins to make sense that I wasn't just shifting jobs, just change jobs to change jobs. The big change was going from law to administration. So I was now still a federal employee, but now moving into Capitol Hill to look at legislation. So I became a legislative assistant to Senator Edward Brooke, but I had to apply. I had to interview with the chief of staff. I had the interview with the senator, and he was impressed with my background. He was impressed with the fact that I was a lawyer, the fact that I had experience in the government as a lawyer, but he was also impressed that I'd spent time as an administrator in the Peace Corps, and he said, I think you would work well dealing with social legislation in my office. Education, Social Security, welfare, all those kinds of social issues I was in charge of as a legislative assistant. So I would watch those issues as they came through and impacted the state of Massachusetts, and then I was involved with creating legislative proposals for the senator. But as I said, he was the only black in the Senate at that time, and was the only African American elected since Reconstruction. Wonderful man. He was a Republican, and when I got a chance to go to Walter Fauntroy's office as chief of staff, and Walter was elected non-voting delegate as a Democrat, I talked to the senator and I said, Senator, I have this opportunity to go possibly to be chief of staff to Walter Fauntroy. He was just elected. He looked at me and he said, are you a Democrat? And I said, yes, Senator, I've worked for you almost 2 years. And he was just that kind of person. I gave him quality work as a legislative assistant. It wasn't partisan, and I worked for him, the people of the state of Massachusetts. But it was a great experience.
And this love of politics has continued throughout your life. You spent over 2 decades working for the telephone company in Washington, D.C. as an executive. During that time, you ran for D.C. City Council, and you talk about this in the book, that you lost that race, considered running again, but decided against it when your wife, Gail, said you'd have to do that as a single man, right? I mean, tell me about the attraction for going from being a staffer to running for office.
Well, I think you hit on it, Fred, when you said politics. I think it was in my DNA, and I think it's something that began to evolve and to come through. Law, communication, living overseas, administration, working on Capitol Hill, and getting a sense that maybe I could do this. Again, a sense of self. Maybe I could be a senator, or maybe I could be a representative. So it was in my thinking. And my thought was, after the time in the telephone company, they thought I could be a telephone executive because as home rule was coming to the district, this was the largest private employer in the city, and they recruited me because they said, we don't have a person in the high level ranks of the company that knows politics, that knows regulation, and knows the city. So we'd like to interest you in coming to work for C&P Telephone, a subsidiary of AT&T.
And you really get an appreciation for this in the book, that the common thread throughout your entire life and all of these very different, interesting jobs is relationships.
Absolutely.
This is so very important. I must say, Delano, though, you have a great advantage in this because you were one of the first people I met when I came here 7 years ago to Las Cruces, and I'm sure people tell you this all the time, that they will meet you and feel like they've known you forever.
Well, thank you very much, Fred. That's very kind. I just feel connection to people. I think people really make differences in your life. And if you're open and receptive, they give you that in return.
But there's a great transition to, it isn't always easy.
No,
I want to
not
ask
at
you
all.
about being president of NPR. You're very candid in the book in that you say at the beginning, you thought you had made a mistake. You had a search firm contact you and wanted you to take this job. You took it, and you ended up working there for 5 years, about 5 years as the president of NPR. But at the beginning, you realized this is an incredible culture switch from working for a corporate entity going into public broadcasting. We now say public media, but at the time, really public broadcasting, right?
Right. You asked very insightful questions. Going back to that 21 years in telecom, I just need to say that it was a great experience. It gave me a great look at the world of business and economics. I was a public servant, a lawyer. I didn't have a sense of business, but 21 years with a mentor there that I talk about in the book, even though I did take out time to run for office, I didn't get elected on your other question, and Gail said, that's enough. And I realized what was important to me, that's my family, and I didn't run again. As luck would have it, and as life has it, the company saw a lot in me that maybe I didn't see in myself, and I kept getting promoted in the company and worked my way up to be president of that entity. So when I took early retirement in 1994, that's when the executive search firm called me and asked if I was interested in National Public Radio. Now, to answer that question, you have to keep in mind now, I have a real business background.
Yeah, more than 2 decades.
That's right.
A long time.
And so I'm coming into this not-for-profit, very distinguished journalistic media company called National Public Radio, with journalists that I've been following for years who are just extremely capable. And I like to say, yes, they like to do their own thing, but very difficult in some ways to manage.
How did you get through this? Because this, again, a few months in to say, I'm not sure that I made the right decision here, that's pretty serious. So tell me about getting through that culture change.
Yes, it's a very good question. Once I took a look at the system, and it was a system of stations. It was a very different system that I had not had a clue about. It's like a cooperative. At that time, there were 600 stations. KRWG is one of those stations at NPR, with a board of overseers, a board of governors and trustees. And there were 16 people on the board. 6 were at large, 10 were station managers. So the same people that could hire and fire me were the same people I was trying to sell products and services to. So it was really kind of very interesting cooperative. A business model that I wasn't familiar with. So I called the head of the board at that time, who had a real stake in my success, Carl Mathewson, and Carl was running 2 stations in Phoenix, a classical station and a jazz station. And I called him and said, you've got to come, we've got to talk. And so Carl flew to Washington, and I remember in our conference room in 635 Mass, we had just moved to that beautiful building. Now they have another beautiful building on North Capitol Street. But we were at 635 Mass Avenue, and I'm sitting in a conference room with Carl, and I had lots of easels, and I'm going through all of the reasons why I'm not sure I'm the person for this job. And Carl was very calm, and he said, let's sit down, let's calm down. And let me give you a history of this organization. And he gave very methodically, very quietly, very calmly, talked to me about how NPR started. And started as an educational institution of several stations dealing with educational TV. Then they came to work together in a more cooperative fashion. And then NPR became the entity that it is today. But he said, so what I got from that discussion was, I need to step back and to understand the culture. And I talk about that in the book. Whether it's a not-for-profit or for-profit, there is cultures in organizations. And you need to have an understanding of it. So I backed off and said, you coming from the business world, you need to understand how NPR operates. You need to step back, get a sense of the culture, and then move forward. So I said to Carl, I'm going to give it a better go.
And you talk about how you do that and still make change.
That's right.
Adjusting to the culture, but also having an impact on it over time as well.
And understanding that culture.
And understanding it. Mm-hmm. We only have a short time left. We could do an entire show on the last topic, but we only have about a minute and a half. So
right.
Being ambassador to South Africa, what an incredible honor and what an incredible experience.
Yes, it's really sort of the pinnacle of all the things that I've done. It just brought to bear my government career, my legal career, my business career, and to get the call from Vice President Gore saying that he was calling on behalf of President Clinton to offer me this position, to nominate me as the U.S. Ambassador to the Republic of South Africa. What an honor. I didn't know I was being considered, but it was an honor. Not to be an ambassador is an honor to represent the country, the United States, but to go to the Republic of South Africa, a country that has gone through tremendous change, but has done it extremely well. And to represent the United States there was just a very, very high honor. So it made a real impact on me and on my family, and I will be truly grateful to President Clinton who made that nomination, and for the United States Senate that confirmed me. So very pleased.
It's been wonderful talking with you here today on Newsmakers, and hopefully we can have you back again to talk about one of your favorite topics, politics, because I think there's a big election next year.
I think there's some things coming up.
I think
right.
something's coming up. Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much,
Fred.
Delano.
A pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much at home for joining us. I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.